Eric.
It's my tour. I got lost.
I know, really. I was noticing that as well.
I have one thing to say to you. Did you love that car?
I did.
Text me.
Well, see, that's how I know you're not mad at me, because you said that you got two.
And I knew you'd be working. Right? You'd probably working on it.
Yeah, you're right.
Comic relief is always welcome. I laughed out loud. You could have heard me. Yeah.
Well, you probably heard me after I opened it then, because I don't think Annie was in her office, so.
I did, yeah, I did.
I was thinking about that yesterday. That day you're here.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Delaware Public Service Commission's meeting of August the 7th. I would like to welcome Commissioner Drexler, who's next to me. She's off the injured reserve list, and she's doing well. And unfortunately, Commissioner Conaway had a family appointment, and so she can't be with us today. But we're ready to proceed, and we have the reading of the meeting minutes of July the 10th of 2018. Or any commissioner have any corrections, additions, or comments to be made with respect to the minutes?
Mr. Chair, I move that the minutes of July 10 be accepted as submitted.
And I second.
Is there any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion carries. July 24th, 2018, same question.
Mr. Chair, I propose that the commission adopt the minutes as submitted for July 24th.
I second it.
Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion, one abstention. The motion carries. The consent agenda, one item. Any commissioner want to take that off the consent agenda or have any questions? If not, if we could have a motion to approve the consent agenda.
I move that we adopt the consent agenda.
And I second.
Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye?
Aye.
Any abstentions? Anybody negative? Hearing none, motion passes. The regular agenda in the matter of the application of Delmarva Power and Light Company for approval of a program for plug-in vehicle charging. So if everybody would interested in that matter, a party to that matter would come forward, it would be greatly appreciated. It appears we have some interest in this particular matter. Okay, welcome everyone tonight. Ms. Iori, were you the one that's going to start this off?
I am, because I guess I'm the first one on either one of them, but which one do you want to hear first? There are two different issues.
Why don't you take them in the order that you would prefer?
Okay, well, we think then that we would address the stay motion first, because if the commission agrees with our motion, then we think the other matter is moot. So with that, I feel like the DPA has to say this whenever we talk about this docket, but we'll reiterate it again. Neither DPA nor staff opposes electric vehicles, nor do we oppose Delmarva providing charging infrastructure and equipment. What we oppose is more than 99% of ratepayers paying for the infrastructure and equipment for less than 1% of ratepayers. We have no problem with Delmarva's offerings as long as the ratepayers aren't on the hook for providing a return of and on Delmarva's investments to their shareholders. Now, the Commission probably remembers that at its July 10th meeting in the Director's Comments session, it considered whether to send a letter to owners and operators of electric vehicle charging stations and equipment, advising them that the Commission would be regulating them as public utilities. And the Sierra Club and DENREC, two of the parties opposing our stay motion, supported not sending that letter to electric vehicle and equipment owners and operators, and pleading with this commission to postpone such letter because legislation would be reintroduced in January addressing this issue. And it's important to note that Delmarva supported Senate Bill 188, and there's no indication that its support has wavered. Now, the Commission did decide at that July 10th meeting to wait and see what the legislature was going to do with the legislation that will be reintroduced, which would deregulate charging station and equipment owners and operators. So for these parties to tell you now that you shouldn't stay this matter because we don't know what the legislature is going to do, to us is the height of hypocrisy. It is hypocritical for these parties to ask you to wait and see what the legislature does with respect to something that at the moment falls within the Commission's jurisdiction, yet proceed with a docket that in large part involves the same products and services that may well be regulated by the General Assembly. Now, the Commission doesn't have to wait for the General Assembly to deregulate electric vehicle charging stations and equipment. It could do so under Section 201D of the Public Utilities Act. That provides that the Commission can forbear from regulating some or all public utility products and services where it determines that a competitive market exists for such products and services, and further finds that such deregulation will be in the public interest. Subsection D2 provides that any application for deregulation must, at a minimum, include specific proposals, supporting testimony, and analysis of the effect of deregulation on the utilities' regulated customers, and an implementation plan. And subsection D5 provides that in making the determination of whether or not to deregulate, the Commission must make specific findings. Now, the Commission didn't do any of those things on July 10th. It simply voted to wait and see what the legislature does next session. But if we can't be sure what the General Assembly is going to do, then why did DENREC and the Sierra Club support postponing this issue until June 30, 2019 on July 10th? Why isn't the Commission regulating electric vehicle charging stations and equipment now? Or why isn't it taking steps pursuant to Section 201 to forbear from deregulation? Why is it waiting to see what the legislature does? Now, DENREC says that we are confusing the legislative and regulatory processes which ordinarily proceed on separate tracks independent of each other. And if that's the case, then the Commission committed the same sin supported by DENREC on July 10th by deciding to wait to see what the legislature does in the next session with respect to deregulating electric vehicle charging stations. And by the way, the reason SB 188 didn't pass last session was not because there was opposition to it. There wasn't. It didn't pass because the House didn't bring it to the floor. As many parties here know, the bill was on the agenda to be worked, but it wasn't. And again, no opposition to that bill. We've been assured that it will be introduced in the next legislative session. And apparently, the parties that appeared before you on July 10th, Tesla, DENREC, Sierra Club, must be pretty confident of that too. Now, it's telling that none of the parties opposing the motion to stay really addresses Delmarva's Code of Conduct, which we cited in our motion. Delmarva calls it a new issue. We're not really sure how it's new. It's a legal issue, so none of our witnesses had to address it. In any event, Delmarva at least acknowledges that we made the argument, but suggests that the code may not be applicable because of its age or some other intervening commission decision. Basically, Delmarva says, move along, nothing to see here. Delmarva had 18 days to respond to the motion to stay, and it has very talented and competent counsel representing it in this docket. If there were some more recent commission order that controlled, we suspect they would have found it. But I can represent to the commission that there is no more recent order that the commission has entered governing Delmarva's participation in unregulated activities. That code of conduct, which the commission approved and which Delmarva has not sought commission leave to amend, as required by Section D of that code of conduct, prevents the regulated utility from recovering from captive ratepayers the costs of conducting unregulated activities. That's why it's important to put this case on hold while we see what the legislature does. Now, our opponents claim that the proposed bill deregulating electric charging stations is consistent with what Delmarva seeks approval for here, but it isn't. The commission has decided to wait to determine whether the legislature will take it off the hook for determining rates to be charged by EV charging station owners and operators. If the legislation passes, third-party owners and operators of charging stations and charging equipment don't have captive ratepayers to fall back on to pay for expenditures it makes to provide charging. But Delmarva does have captive ratepayers, and it wants those captive ratepayers to fund its foray into electric vehicle chargers and equipment for the less than 1% that own them. DENREC accuses us of being erratic, saying stay it on the one hand, but push it forward faster on the other. We are not being erratic. It's a result of what the commission did on July 10th. If the commission grants the stay, the exceptions are pretty much moot. If the commission doesn't grant the stay, then the exceptions are not moot, and our request to reject Delmarva's request and schedule the hearing stands. Now, recall that you didn't decide to refrain from regulating EV charging stations pending what the legislature did until your meeting on July 10th. Delmarva asked the hearing examiner to postpone the proceedings on June 22nd, and we argued it to the hearing examiner on July 3rd. I'm not sure how we were supposed to intuit when we argued to the hearing examiner about whether the case should be postponed to allow Delmarva to support its report that the commission was going to consider regulating electric charging stations when the agenda didn't come out until later in the day on July 3rd. I'm good at predicting some things, but one thing I've never been good at is predicting what this commission will do. The Sierra Club asserts that deregulation of electric vehicle charging stations and allowing utilities to invest in EV infrastructure and recover that investment plus a return from ratepayers is what some states considering the issue have done. But many of those states that it identifies have stated a specific policy to encourage EV adoption. Delaware has not stated such a policy. In fact, even though there was some $100 million of one-time funding available in this year's capital improvement budget, no one advocated that any or all of that money be used to encourage adoption of EVs in Delaware, or to install more charging stations, or to subsidize EV owners by offering charging equipment to them at reduced prices. And I repeat, no one, not even DENREC. Moreover, other jurisdictions have come to the conclusion that operating charging stations is an unregulated activity. The Missouri Commission came to that conclusion and held that if Amarant spent money on charging stations and equipment, it could not recover any of the costs from ratepayers. The California PUC itself came to the same conclusion, but it was only recently that it changed its mind in response to legislation and the governor's push for more electric vehicles. Governor Brown in California ordered 1.5 million electric vehicles on the road by 2025, and California's Energy Commission's analysis projects a need of up to 279,000 charger. That's one charger for every 5.38 vehicles. In Delaware, we have one charger for every 4 vehicles right now. Now, Delmarva points to the NSUCA resolution and expresses wonder at how the DPA can possibly agree with that resolution. I dare say that the Delaware Public Service Commission doesn't agree with every resolution that NARUC, its umbrella organization, passes. But what's even more amazing to us about this argument is Delmarva's cherry picking from that resolution. Delmarva ignores the following language on page 3, second paragraph. Quote, NSUCA maintains that any utility proposals to promote electric vehicle adoption and or develop electric vehicle infrastructure through ratepayers' investment must leverage all related private, state, and federal funding sources, end quote. That has not occurred. As I mentioned earlier, although there was $100 million available in this year's capital improvement budget, no one advocated that any or all of that money be used for anything involving EVs. Paragraph 3 on that same page of the NSUCA resolution states, quote, NSUCA maintains to protect monopoly distribution customers from subsidizing competitive services that any tariffs for electric vehicle charging be cost-based without reliance on cross-subsidies from other ratepayers, end quote. And paragraph 4 on that same page states, quote, NSUCA recommends that the costs associated with the promotion and development of the electric vehicle industry be borne by the transportation sector consistent with principles of cost causation, end quote. Those are the very positions that we have taken, but Delmarva ignores those parts of the resolution. Delmarva also argues that the DPA and staff tried to circumvent the process of having the hearing examiner decide our motion first. Now, this argument is a smokescreen that has nothing to do with the merits of the stay motion, but to the extent that Delmarva suggests that we tried to pull a fast one, we take umbrage at that. Delmarva cites the opening order and the order substituting Mr. Lawrence as the hearing examiner after Mr. Hayes' departure, but again, this is an example of Delmarva cherry-picking what it thinks supports it and ignoring what comes after. What it doesn't cite to you is the rest of the paragraph of that order. What Delmarva cited to you is this, that R. Campbell Hay is designated as hearing examiner for this matter pursuant to the terms of 26 Delaware Code Section 502 and 29 Delaware Code Chapter 101 to schedule and conduct, upon due notice, such public comment sessions and evidentiary hearings as may be necessary to have a full and complete record concerning the justness and reasonableness of the proposed program. Here's what Delmarva left out. Thereafter, hearing examiner Hay shall file with the commission his proposed findings and recommendations pursuant to Rule 21 of the Commission's Rules of Practice and Procedure. Hearing examiner Hay is specifically delegated the authority to grant or deny petitions seeking leave to intervene and for admission of counsel pro hoc vice. In addition, hearing examiner Hay is delegated the authority under 26 Delaware Code Section 102A to determine the form and matter of any further public notice in this matter. Notice that it doesn't delegate to the hearing examiner the authority to decide substantive motions. It only provides the hearing examiner with the authority to grant or deny petitions for intervention, to admit counsel pro hoc vice, and to determine the form and manner of further public notice. Nothing in the Commission's rules or any of the orders it entered in this case require substantive matters to first be heard by the hearing examiner. So it is at least arguable that the Commission didn't delegate to the hearing examiner any authority to decide our stay motion in the first place. But let's assume that it did give the hearing examiner that authority. We filed the motion on July 13th, 11 days before the Commission hearing on July 24th. Now, Delmarva takes us to task for filing our motion with the Commission, but with all due respect, who else were we supposed to file it with? We filed it with the Commission because everything filed gets filed with the Commission, except discovery, and this isn't discovery. There is no ability just to file something with the hearing examiner. So it seems to us this argument is an attempt to justify Delmarva's improperly filing its request for a postponement through a letter to the hearing examiner, despite the Commission rules requiring requests for relief to be filed as a motion. But we also sent a copy of our motion to the hearing examiner. He is the first person identified on our certificate of service as having been sent a copy of the motion electronically, and we know he got it. He could have provided a deadline to respond so that he could make a decision, as he has many, many times, but he didn't. Instead, he punted it to you. He established a deadline of July 31st for responses and then decreed that the Commission would hear our motion at this meeting. So if Delmarva has a bone to pick with anyone, it's not the DPA and staff, it's the hearing examiner. I further note that when the DPA filed a motion to compel in this docket in the exact same manner, By filing it as a motion and filing it on Delafile, the hearing examiner took control of that motion. Finally, Delmarva calls the relief that the DPA and staff seeks, quote, extraordinary, end quote. We are not sure how it is any more extraordinary than Delmarva waiting until rebuttal testimony is almost due to spring an entirely new report that it commissioned on the parties. And its requested relief acknowledges that the proceeding will be delayed if its request is granted. So Delmarva's talking out of both sides of its mouth here. On the one hand, this case has been pending for a long time, which of course is what the DPA said in opposing Delmarva's attempt to introduce its report through rebuttal. And on the other hand, it will have to be delayed for the other parties to be able to review, digest, and perhaps address the report if the commission grants the relief that Delmarva seeks. One way or the other, there's going to be delay. So in summary, the DPA and staff, through this stay motion, are not asking the commission to dismiss this docket. We are simply asking you to wait, just as you are with the electric vehicle charging station equipment owners and operators, to see what the legislature does. If it is appropriate to wait to determine whether EV charging stations and equipment are going to be regulated as public utility products and services for the purposes of determining rates for them, we believe it is equally appropriate to wait and see if they are not going to be considered public utility products and services to determine whether Delmarva ratepayers should pay for them. Therefore, the staff and DPA respectfully request the commission to stay this proceeding until the legislature has taken action on whether or not to remove EV charging from the definition of, quote, public utility, end quote. I thank you for your consideration, and I would like to reserve a little time to address what some of the other parties might say if necessary.
Thank you, Ms. Iori.
Thank you, Chair Winslow.
Does the staff have any comments to make?
Anything we say would be duplicative of what Ms. Iori said, so we just support everything that she said.
Thank you. Delmarva?
Thank you, Chair Winslow and Commissioners. Good afternoon. Lindsay Orr on behalf of Delmarva Power. As we discuss in our papers, public service commissions across the country are actively addressing the electrification of our transportation system and its impact on their distribution systems and ratepayers. Experts estimate that as many as 50% of new car sales nationally in 2040 will be electric vehicles. The addition of one electric vehicle increases the average household electricity usage by about 20%. So we're talking about potentially very significant increased usage across the grid. Delmarva filed this modest $2 million electric vehicle, Delmarva filed this modest $2 million electric vehicle program in October of 2017. In its application, paragraph 35, Delmarva mentioned that the Commission had recently declined to open a docket to explore the manner in which EV charging services would be treated by the Commission, and that the Commission would be pursuing legislation to clarify what is defined as a public utility. Delmarva committed, in paragraph 35 of the application, to take any necessary action to conform its program to the requirements of any such resulting legislation. Following Delmarva's October filing, the parties filed direct testimony and exchanged discovery, working toward evidentiary hearings that were originally scheduled for July 11th and 12th. No party raised the issue of the potential legislation referenced in Delmarva's application in their direct testimony or asked Delmarva about it in their discovery requests. The hearing examiner held a teleconference on July 3rd and heard argument on Delmarva's request for a modest extension of the procedural schedule to allow for the production and consideration of a highly relevant analysis of the cost and benefits of Delmarva's proposed program on all ratepayers. Counsel for DPA argued during that teleconference that the evidentiary hearing should move forward as scheduled on July 11th. On July 13th, almost 10 months after Delmarva filed its application and just over a week after that teleconference, DPA and staff jointly filed a motion to stay the proceedings for up to a year to allow for the possibility that legislation that was not enacted by the 149th General Assembly might be reintroduced in the 150th General Assembly, approved and signed by the governor. For the reasons I will discuss, Delmarva respectfully requests this motion and proposed order 9256 be denied. As grounds for this motion, reference is made to Senate Bill 188, which would have amended the definition of public utility to exempt providers of electric vehicle charging stations from regulation as a public utility. That bill was not enacted in the 149th General Assembly. The motion asserts that the bill will be renewed in the next legislative session. No basis is given for this belief other than Council's statement just now that they have been assured it will be reintroduced. But there's simply no guarantee that this bill will be reintroduced in identical form or in modified form in the next General Assembly. As we detail in our papers, the next General Assembly will include unprecedented levels of turnover in both the Senate and the House of Representatives, including at least 2 members of the House Energy Committee. Such uncertainty does not justify staying these important proceedings for a year. Even if a bill substantially similar to Senate Bill 188 passes the next General Assembly and is signed by the governor, such legislation is not inconsistent with Delmarva's proposed program. Delmarva's proposed program consists of 7 separate offerings, several of which do not involve ownership of charging stations, but instead involve time of use rates and other incentives to induce electric vehicle charging off-peak and to allow Delmarva to study the effect of an influx of electric vehicles on the grid. There is no reason, even with the passage of a bill substantially similar to Senate Bill 188, that those particular offerings could not proceed. Moreover, as set forth in detail in Sierra Club's opposition to the motion, many other states have found no tension or inconsistency between exempting owners and operators of public charging stations from regulation by public service commissions and the review and approval of utility programs to deploy electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Likewise, there is no tension or inconsistency between Senate Bill 188 and Delmarva's proposal. In any event, following an evidentiary hearing, the hearing examiner and then subsequently the commission may place any conditions on approval of Delmarva's program that they see fit to address any issues they may see with respect to any potential legislation. Additionally, to the extent Delmarva's program is approved by the commission and subsequent legislation conflicts with certain portions of that program, Delmarva will certainly work with the commission to bring its program into compliance with the legislation. In fact, Delmarva promised to do this exact thing when we filed our application in October. Delmarva acknowledged then that the commission would be pursuing legislation to clarify what is defined as a public utility. Delmarva stated in its application, quote, "In the event that legislation is enacted which requires the modification of any of the terms and conditions of the PIV program, the company will take necessary action to conform its program to the requirements of the legislation," end quote. That continues to be the case today. If DPA and staff thought that this docket should be held until any such legislation passed, they had since October to raise that issue. They never mentioned it in their direct testimony, and they never asked any discovery requests regarding it. Instead, they waited almost 10 months to raise it. The argument should be considered waived. For these reasons, Delmarva respectfully requests that the motion to stay be denied and that the commission deny proposed order number 9256. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Orr. Denrick?
Either way is fine. Go ahead. Thank you, Commissioner. I will try and keep my comments fairly brief.
Would you identify yourself for the record,
Jameson
please?
Tweedy, Deputy Attorney General representing Denrick. We support the denial of the motion to stay. We reiterate many of the reasons stated by Delmarva, and I'll try and keep my comments fairly brief. I think to some extent the issues that are relevant to the motion to the stay, which are fairly discrete and resolve around SB 188, were somewhat broadened in Ms. Iori's comments to include the report that was filed. They are relevant to each other in chronology, but not to the issues upon which they filed their motion. So their motion is related to SB 188. And it is an abrupt turnaround from, as Delmarva's counsel mentioned, their position that the evidentiary hearing should continue on July 10th and 11th when this was presented to the hearing examiner by teleconference on July 3rd. In any case, This issue has been well known for a long time and is suddenly just raised now. And attempting to anticipate what the General Assembly might do is a dodgy proposition in any circumstance, but certainly in this year where it is known that there will be significant turnover, as was discussed by Delmarva's council. Even if there was a reason to try and anticipate what the legislature would do, the bill that is proposed is not in conflict with what is being presented on this docket, and the actions which are contemplated are entirely consistent with SB 188, as was very well spelled out in Sierra Club's submission. To the extent that the Commission wants to consider the substance of the Gable report, which I don't think is really relevant to the issue of the motion to stay, the salient point of that report, or one of the salient points, is that EV plug-in vehicles or electric vehicles will be expanding dramatically, and that there needs to be a thoughtful and proactive effort to regulate and manage those vehicles, or it may have negative consequences on electrical supply. But with proactive management, that there can be significant benefits that flow not only to those people with EVs, but to all ratepayers. So in sum, DENREC fully supports denying the motion to stay. We think this docket should move forward. We do not think that SB 188 justifies a one-year delay of this docket, and that it should proceed on a schedule established by the hearing examiner.
Thank you, Mr. Tweedy. Is the Sierra Club here and represented?
Yes, we are, Your Honor. Kenneth Crystal on behalf of the Sierra Club, and my sole job is to introduce my co-counsel, Joshua Berman, who has been granted leave to appear pro hac vice, and so I'm going to let him address the issue.
Thank you, Commissioner Chair Winslow, members of the Commission, Josh Berman for the Sierra Club. Sierra Club has been involved in proceedings similar to this in states around the country over the past 4 years. We are involved, as we noted, in our opposition filing in 18 different states at this point. I personally work in all the states in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. And I guess, you know, just to boil this down as simple as possible, we believe that if you parse carefully what is actually proposed in Senate Bill 188, or a theoretical future bill that might come up in the next legislature, and what Delmarva is proposing to do in this docket, there is simply no inconsistency or tension. And I believe the best evidence of this is if you look, there are at least, at this point, I found at least 20 states that have concluded that site hosts of electric vehicle charging infrastructure that do not become public utilities simply by virtue of selling electric charging services to the public, but public utilities that are already regulated by public service commissions, you know, are fully authorized, consistent with other governing regulations, to take actions to support and to accelerate deployment of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. We identified 7 different states that have both concluded that, you know, public that site hosts that are providing charging services are not regulated by the Public Service Commission, or do not become, public utilities by virtue of taking that action, but that public utilities that are already regulated by commissions are fully authorized, again, subject to what other constraints they have on them, to take actions to support deployment of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. You know, I think if we parse closely what Ms. Uriai was saying just now, you know, I think I just urge the Commission to think very, very carefully about what exactly the purported tension is here, because I'm not seeing it. Whether or not the rates that would be charged at stations that would be deployed by Delmarva in this proceeding are subject to regulation by the Commission, I believe is a separate issue from whether or not Delmarva should be able to or would be authorized to use ratepayer money to invest in to support deployment of electric vehicle charging stations. Those are simply different issues. In the states that I work in all cases where utilities are proposing to own and operate EV charging infrastructure, the actual rates at those stations are subject to approval through tariffs by the commission. That's never been a controversial issue. So I guess, to me, I do take a little bit of umbrage at the assertion that the Sierra Club is being inconsistent here about whether or not there's going to be legislation. Whether or not that legislation is going to look exactly like the legislation that we saw in this last session, I think is an unknown question. I think that the prospect of delaying a case by a year based on the possibility that a future legislature would enact legislation is a dodgy proposition to begin with. But I think the most fundamental point, and the one that we would come back to, is if you look at what other states have done, many states have looked at exactly the two issues that are in front of the commission right now. Does provision of EV charging services subject you to regulation as a public utility, and have said no unequivocally to that? And then can public utilities that are already subject to commission regulation make investments to support deployment of EV charging infrastructure, and have largely said yes? So I guess to us, we urge the commission to look very, very carefully at what the purported tension is here, because we do not believe that this is a tension that any other state has recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Furman. Is there any other party here I haven't called upon? Yeah, I think David Stevenson is on the phone, if there's nobody else here in the room. Mr. Stevenson?
Yes, I am on the phone. Greetings from New Orleans.
Lucky you.
Is there any tension or umbrage going on down there?
I can tell you I had dinner at a restaurant that said they had the best baked ham in the world, and I agreed with it. So come on down. A couple of comments. First of all, I agree with everything Ms. Iori had to say in her magnificent presentation, as usual. I would add just a couple of things. One, about the timeliness of this motion. I'm also the lobbyist for the Cesar Rodney Institute. I was in Legislative Hall till early hours of July 1st, and everyone thought that this bill would be passed, and it was not an issue to bring up before that point. So early July, in July, this motion was made. It was not really out of time. Everybody thought the bill was going to pass, and that would have been the end of it. Second point is a sense of urgency. Obviously, Delmarva, in asking for a delay to the hearing schedule, and kind of an unknown amount of time that would be needed to answer and restart the hearing schedule, would suggest that Delmarva did not have a real sense of urgency of getting this done. And if there's two points here about urgency. One is, does Delmarva need this information desperately about what the effect of charging will do? Well, if that's the case, over a year ago, Baltimore Gas and Electric and Delmarva Power Maryland were approved for programs similar to this. I assume that they could talk to sister companies to get that information if it's a dire need for time. Secondly, if there's a dire need for new charging stations to be built, DENREC is sitting on billions and millions of dollars of RGGI money and Volkswagen settlement money that could be deployed to build any number of charging stations without Delmarva's customers paying the bill for it. So I just don't see that this is an urgent issue, that if we delay for a year, I think there's a high, as a lobbyist, I think there's a high probability the same exact legislation will come back very early next year. And we won't be waiting a year for that answer. We'll have it shortly. So thank you, and sorry you're not down here with me.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson.
Chair Winslow, a few.
Mr. Furman, right now, Ms. Iori would like to open your eyes and explain the tension that you can't seem to comprehend. Ms. Iori.
Thank you.
Actually, I think I've already addressed that, unless the commission has a question. But I really only have a few points. I know how unlike me not to have a whole list full on rebuttal, but I really do only have a few points. Delmarva, in saying that in their application, they would conform their program to whatever the legislation did, isn't that all the more reason to stay this? Why go through everything and then find that you have to conform something to do, basically maybe to do it over again? Doesn't it make more sense just to stay it right now, see what happens, and go from there? Secondly, we agree with Mr. Stevenson that, who says it's going to be 1 year. They keep saying 1 year, 1 year. Well, the bill was introduced last time in April, so it wasn't a full year. Yeah, April 30th of 2018, so it was not a full year from the last time the commission did this. Secondly, Mr. Tweedy mentioned the report. Well, we have a couple of things to say about that. That should not be part of your consideration on this motion. It's not part of any record yet. It hasn't been cross-examined. There is nothing, I mean, the commission should give that report in the context of this motion, no consideration. Now, and also going to even assuming that it might take a year to get it, well, the commission has delayed regulating electric vehicle stations for a year. So, if there's no hurry for that, we don't really see that there's any hurry for this either. And finally, and I guess I do kind of address maybe the interest of why there's an inconsistency. And here's why there's the inconsistency. These are potentially competitive products and services that Delmarva will be able to recover the costs of from ratepayers, but other third-party providers will not be. And that, we think, is the tension and the inconsistency. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Iori. Commissioners, do you have any questions? Commissioner Gray?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I've taken a couple of notes, and it comes to mind, the first question for me is, what's in the public interest here? The second question I have is, if this matter is not stayed, what happens next and by when?
Your Honor, we would suggest that it's in the public interest to stay this. And again, as we have noted, this particular, I really was trying to kind of stay away from it a little bit because it goes to the merits of the application itself, but we don't think the public interest is harmed by waiting to see what happens here. There, as I mentioned, there is one charging station for every 4 electric vehicles in this state. There doesn't seem to be any great outcry for additional electric vehicle charging stations. And at least we have not heard, the public advocate, certainly gets a lot of calls that, for people who want to complain about things. And the public advocate hasn't received any calls complaining that there are an insufficient number of charging stations or that people can't charge their electric vehicles at their own homes. We think it's not in the public interest for this to go forward and potentially have ratepayers, all ratepayers, paying for the less than 1% of Delawareans, and that's not Delmarva ratepayers, that's Delawareans total who have electric vehicles. Now, where are we going forward? Well, that depends on what you do here. We don't have a schedule going forward. We had a rebuttal deadline of June 27th, and we had evidentiary hearings scheduled for July 11th and 12th, but those have been knocked off kilter by Delmarva seeking to introduce this study and the fight that we've had about that, which if the commission decides not to stay this proceeding, that's what you're going to hear about next. Who knows how long we are going to, how long it's going to go out, because the public advocate's position in that is that if the commission does allow Delmarva to introduce this, then either we ought to start the whole case over, or at the very least, the public advocate and staff and Caesar Rodney, if it wants to, ought to be allowed to address the report in testimony, which we have not been allowed to do now. So that would require discovery. That would require us to submit additional testimony. And I expect Delmarva would want to have rebuttal testimony on that. So I can't answer your second question because that's up in the air.
Could I get an answer on those two questions from Delmarva, please?
Yes, Commissioner Gray, thank you. With respect to the public interest, not surprisingly, it is Delmarva's position that this docket should move forward. I recognize that both Ms. Iori and Mr. Stevenson made the point that there's going to be a delay either way, but there is, because of the report that Delmarva is seeking to introduce, but there's a difference between a modest delay during which all of the parties will be working to move the docket forward in terms of discovery on the Gable report and moving forward, as opposed to just letting the docket sit dormant for a year. I think it is evident from a lot of the literature out there, I think some of which is already in this docket, but more and more is being produced every day, that this is a very rapidly evolving area of utility law. I recognize that the Gable report is a separate issue, but it raises a number of points about how rapidly the electric vehicle market is expected to increase, as well as the benefits to all ratepayers, not just those with EVs. So it is Delmarva's position that this docket should not simply sit for a year while many other states, many of which Council for Sierra Club mentioned, continue to move forward. Delaware is in a very unique position in the Mid-Atlantic corridor, surrounded by a lot of other states that are also considering electric vehicle programs, and I think it's important that we not fall too far behind our neighboring jurisdictions and continue to push this issue forward, because it seems to be one that's not going to be going away. And with respect to your second question about what happens next and when, I do agree with Ms. Iori on the point that that is a little bit up in the air and will depend on what happens with the request to introduce the Gable report. Right now, the schedule is stayed. Obviously, the hearings did not happen on July 11th and 12th, and it is up to the commission to determine what happens next. And it is Delmarva's position that what happens next should be the parties are given an opportunity to consider the Gable report, and then we move forward with any discovery that they wish to take, any rebuttal testimony that they wish to file. Delmarva does not oppose the other parties filing additional testimony responding to the Gable report, and then moving on from there with the schedule.
Thank you. Any other witnesses want to weigh in on this? These two questions? No?
I have a question.
Commissioner Correa?
All of you have been mentioning about 1 year delay, and Mr. Stevenson had mentioned that this may not be 1 year delay. So suppose it's approved in January. Suppose the legislature picks it up in January, they approve it, and suppose that this commission is known to act very fast, if needed. Not every time. And not every time Delmarva comes here, or Dan Rep or anyone else comes here. So if we do all those things, what kind of a harm, financial harm, do you foresee for the users of those charging stations? Will the rates go up in 4 months?
Commissioner Correa, Delmarva's position on that would be, the hearing examiner mentioned, at least during the teleconference with the parties, I'm not sure if it was in his written report or not, but he said that he anticipated that even with an extension of the schedule to allow the Gable report to be considered, that this docket could still be wrapped up by the end of 2018. Now, of course, we've taken a little more time now to deal with these motions and procedural items, but even still, it could still potentially be wrapped up before the legislature even comes back into session in January. So even if, to your point, that it would not necessarily be an entire year, that would still be a longer extension than what we would be looking at otherwise. And I would just go back to my statements previously about how quickly this docket is moving. I mean, every time there's a deadline for us to respond to a paper or something, there's another document or another resolution or another article has come out about this issue and how quickly it's moving. And we just, don't want to fall too far behind in the consideration of that.
Commissioner Correa, may I address your question?
Yes.
Thank you. Actually, what Ms. Orr just said is very interesting, how rapidly things are evolving. Yeah, they really are rapidly evolving, and we could very well wind up with stranded investment pushing this thing through. So, secondly, you asked what financial harm. I would suggest to you that there is no financial harm to Delmarva. They won't be spending any money. So if you stay this, they will not be spending any money to do this, so there will be no financial harm.
Commissioner Correa,
One more
may I respond as well? So I guess I appreciate that you've hypothesized a situation in which the legislation is enacted and it's identical to Senate Bill 188, and that occurs at the beginning of the legislative session. Equally possible that does not get enacted at all in this legislative session. We're back here in a year asking there's a stay request until the following legislative session. I would urge the commission to engage the actual question here, which in my mind is there actually a tension between the content of Senate Bill 188 and what is being proposed by Delmarva here? I think the possibility that Mr. Stevenson raised that, the stay, we could, be out of the stay, in only 5 months from now, is a bit of a red herring, because at that point we're still going to be confronting the question. There's going to be a motion filed at that time to say this whole thing should be dismissed because now there's a tension between what's being proposed and this legislation that just got enacted. So I think that there's no way around dealing with the question of whether or not there's a tension. And I'll stop there. I would urge the commission to focus on that, because I think that is the dispositive issue here.
Commissioner Drexler?
Reading all these, about all these issues and listening to everybody talk about issues, I mean, it's starting to add up to a lot of different issues. And I think bringing it home, we're trying to determine whether to have a stay. We're not determining who's going to pay. We're not determining which programs will be a go, whether Delmarva will or will not be out any money. I mean, I think that's important focus for us as commissioners. And as an aside, I'm having a hard time wrapping my arms around the figure, Ms. Iori, regarding one charging station for every 4 vehicles. And, explain that to me, just because it seems like a lot. Does that include hybrid and pure EV vehicles? And does that include public charging stations as well as residential, home outlets that may have been put in for charging? I'm just confused about that number. It seems startling.
I'm going to let Mr. Slater take that because he's my facts guy.
Commissioner Drexler, so the 1 in 4, so if you go to plug share, it shows you that there's more than 100 outlets. The DMV themselves have said that there's less than 400 electric vehicles. I think it's 374.
Including hybrids?
So hybrids by DelDOT are actually considered gasoline vehicles, so they don't have a quantification for how many there are. However, there is some, so part of the 1% was presuming that there were 700 rebates given out by DENREC. So we were adding that into the number to say there's about 1,000, which is actually in part of, I think, DENREC's testimony. I think it's in our testimony as well. So we were going off of that number, and we were able to come up with about 1 in 4 charging stations.
Commissioner Drexler, may I speak to that as well? I would just like to remind the commission that there are 7 separate offerings in Delmarva's program, and public charging stations are only a few of those offerings. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind because, 1 in 4, may sound like a lot of chargers. Now, I would make the point that we're also attempting to, we'd like to see electric vehicle ownership increase. We think it's going to, but there's a lot more to Delmarva's program than just the chargers, including, incentives to incentivize people to charge off peak so Delmarva can study the effect of the incentives, can study the impact on the grid. There's just a lot going on with this program, so I just want to remind the commission about that. Thank you.
There are actually only 2 of potential things that are not impacted by this. One is the time of use rates, which Delmarva already has time of use rates. The other is providing 2 electric school buses or or what? Or $400,000 for the purchase of electric buses.
Commissioner Gray?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm gonna make an attempt at summarizing, I think, what I've heard, and I guess the direction that I'm leaning. I don't really think there's a reason to stay the EV docket for nearly a year based on the supposition legislation will be introduced or passed in the next legislative session. Ms. Iori, you made the point that we seem inconsistent when we set aside sending letters and waiting until the legislation came forward. I see there's a little distinction between immediately sending a letter of notice of our authority over EV infrastructure as opposed to receiving program proposals and conducting hearings to make informed decisions about EV infrastructure. One is kind of finite, it happens right away. We took the step of intervening with that and postponing it through the legislative session. But I don't see the same immediacy in moving forward with these hearings. One more second, please.
Ms. Iori, there's not going to be any argument after this.
No, I was just going to ask a question,
I
but
think-
that's okay.
I think also what I'm feeling is that there seems to be the perception that Delmarva's program is simply a cost to ratepayers. But what if their proposal is actually an investment that could deliver valued returns to ratepayers? So evidentiary hearings, in my view, should continue. And I move that the motion number 9256 to stay the proceedings should be denied.
And I second that.
Is there any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed?
Oppose.
Any abstentions? The motion carries. Ms. Iori?
Thank you. Well, now we're moving on to the exceptions, and you may hear some of the same argument, but now it's going to be in a different sort of thing, in a different context. I'm going to have Vanna White here hand out some things to you that I'll be referring to in my argument. In this respect, not only did Delmarva fail to follow the Commission's rules for filing its request for relief as a motion, but it now uses the exception deadline to submit written support for the hearing examiner's ruling. Its submission obviously is an exceptions, which were what was due on July 31st, and should be rejected, but we are going to assume you've read it and are going to consider it. Our first exception is that the hearing examiner used the report that he received on July 6th to justify an oral ruling he made on July 3rd. He used a report he didn't have, nor had he read, to justify a ruling he made 3 days earlier. We are not sure how that is proper. How do you support a ruling you made with something you didn't have when you made the ruling? We respectfully submit that you can't. It is completely and totally inappropriate. The hearing examiner's decision has to rest on what he was told at the time, which was Delmarva's letters, our letter in response, and whatever else he had when he heard oral argument on July 3rd, not the report. Now, Delmarva argues in its submission that the Commission should apply the standard that applies to interlocutory appeals because that's essentially what this is. And then it cites case law from our courts to try to support its argument that we have not met the standard for an interlocutory appeal. Now, let me be clear. The DPA and staff did not write the hearing examiner's proposed findings and recommendations. The hearing examiner did, and he's the one that called them proposed findings and recommendations and issued a proposed order. A proposed order is not a final order. It suggests that some further action is needed. We assumed he had his reasons for calling it what he did. And indeed, on June 24th, in a real discovery motion in this docket, which the DPA filed with the Commission, same as it did with its motion to stay, the hearing examiner issued an order with a number on it, making a ruling that he signed, and that's the first document in the group that I gave you. He didn't issue proposed findings and recommendations and a proposed order. Now, after we received the proposed findings and recommendations and proposed order, we emailed the hearing examiner and said because they were styled as proposed findings and recommendations, we would take our 20 days to file exceptions. We did that on the same day that the hearing examiner issued his proposed findings and recommendations. The hearing examiner could have changed them from proposed findings and recommendations and a proposed order to a final order on that matter that day, but he didn't. So again, if Delmarva has a beef, it's with the hearing examiner, not with us. Now, we disagree with Delmarva that the commission has to apply the interlocutory appeal standard, but in this case, we submit that it doesn't really matter because reversal is justified even under the more stringent interlocutory appeal standard. Commission Rule 1001.2.16 provides the standard for an interlocutory appeal. Extraordinary circumstances necessitate a prompt commission decision to prevent substantial injustice or detriment to the public interest. The cases that Delmarva cites are from courts which use a different standard than that, so they are of no help to the commission or to Delmarva. There are indeed extraordinary circumstances that necessitate your prompt decision. The hearing examiner's proposed order does not give staff or the DPA an opportunity to submit rebuttal testimony addressing the report. So a hearing will take place without the DPA and staff being able to address the report in written testimony. So if the commission does not hear this matter now, it will be moot by the time it does come to the commission, and that makes it an extraordinary circumstance. What's also extraordinary is how Delmarva hid the fact that its parent had engaged Gable to prepare this report from other parties until a week before its rebuttal testimony was due, and only then sprung it on the other parties in an effort to delay the procedural schedule. As far as we know, no one else knew about the report. It's possible that Delmarva told someone else, but it never told the DPA and it never told staff. And here's another thing it hasn't told anybody. When exactly did Exelon engage Gable? Was it before Delmarva filed its application in October of 2017? Was it before the procedural schedule was approved in January 2018? Was it before interveners filed direct testimony was it before Delmarva filed direct testimony in February of 2018? Was it before interveners filed their testimony in May 2018? If Gable had been retained before Delmarva filed this application, or before a procedural schedule was approved, or before it filed its direct testimony, why couldn't it have waited until the report was finalized and submitted with that direct testimony? Or why couldn't it have told the other parties that this report was coming so that the interveners might have, and delay it so that the interveners may have had an opportunity to address it? Any one of those options would have been fair to the other parties, particularly the ones opposing the application. But no. Instead, Delmarva sprung this report on everyone a week before rebuttal was due. How is that fair? It seems that fairness has only gone one way in this case, and that's what's fair to Delmarva. The hearing examiner was clearly concerned about fairness to Delmarva when staff and the DPA sought to have the commission hear our stay motion at the last meeting, but he wasn't very concerned about whether the report would introduce new matter that staff and the DPA would not be able to address in pre-filed testimony. Now, with respect to when Delmarva knew about it, it appears as though it might have known the study had been commissioned before the schedule was even approved. We can't be certain because the wording is pretty careful, but the second paragraph of its June 22nd letter says, quote, "Because we were not aware of the precise scope, its particular relevance to Delaware, or the completion date of the study, Delmarva Power proceeded with the schedule in this case without modification," end quote. Another interpretation is that Delmarva didn't mention the report before June 22nd because it didn't want to do so until it was sure the report benefited it. In any event, we respectfully submit that the circumstances surrounding this dispute and the proposed order that the hearing examiner issued, which would deny staff and DPA the ability to submit pre-filed testimony addressing the report, provide the extraordinary circumstances that the commission requires for an interlocutory appeal. Next, the hearing examiner's ruling causes substantial injustice to the DPA and staff for that same reason. It does not give them the opportunity to present direct testimony addressing the report. The hearing examiner's proposed order gives us discovery on the report, but so what? Discovery without an opportunity to submit our own testimony addressing the report does nothing. As we stated in our joint filing, we have additional testimony we'd like to add to make the record more complete. When do we get to add that information? I'm fairly certain Delmarva's answer, at least right now, would be never. Well, let's remember that it's Delmarva's counsel and the hearing examiner who stated that this issue, electric vehicles, is evolving. If they see it as evolving, it's not complete. We should be able to present additional testimony on the report since the issue is evolving. Now, in my 30 years of doing work or appearing before this commission, I can only think of one other case in which anything even close to what's happening here occurred, and that was in docket 05-304. And Delmarva was the one arguing that it had been ambushed in that case. The commission did hear an interlocutory appeal in that case. And I remind you that in Delmarva's last rate case, docket 16-0649, it heard staff's interlocutory appeal, even though that case had resulted in a settlement and there was really nothing left to appeal. Now, Delmarva argues that the Gable report is important to resolve this docket, and we assume that it is, but so what? If it was that important, Delmarva should have told the parties about it earlier instead of waiting 1 week before rebuttal testimony was due and 3 weeks before the evidentiary hearings. We doubt Delmarva would be asking to submit the report if it wasn't helpful to its case. As this issue evolves, again, the same word that the Delmarva and the hearing examiner used, we'd like to have the opportunity to present additional helpful and important information to the commission too. So imagine the shoe is on the other foot for a moment. Can you imagine if it was the DPA or staff who called Delmarva's counsel a few weeks before the evidentiary hearings and asked Delmarva if they would agree to postpone the hearings so that the DPA could submit a report it had commissioned that no other party knew about, but that would be helpful to the commission? I can. Delmarva would object just like we are here. How do I know that? Because Delmarva objected to staff's submission of revised testimony and schedules in the electric rate case where staff was trying to remove a contested issue that reduced staff's recommended revenue decrease. Under the logic that the hearing examiner used to grant Delmarva's request, the information will be helpful to the commission. In an evolving industry, there will always be additional information that will help the commission. In fact, here are a few things that came out after the DPA and staff and other interveners filed direct testimony that might also help the commission, and those are in the documents that we gave you. The first two involved a company called Blink Charging Company. In one of these, Blink announced that it has developed a fast electric charging technology that can cut charging time by 2/3 and is compatible with amperages from 12 to 80 amps to work in a variety of locations, which could potentially make the charging infrastructure and equipment that Delmarva has in its application obsolete, which would result in stranded costs to Delmarva's captive ratepayers. The next document talks about Blink's agreement with an Israeli company to integrate Blink's charging technology into light poles. The third one talks about Honda offering drivers of its electric Fit vehicle to determine the most environmentally friendly charging times and possibly earning monetary incentives to move demand off-peak through an app. Yes, there really is an app for that. Again, evolving technology, which Delmarva's not creating. It doesn't have an R&D department. Can the staff and DPA submit testimony about this now so that the record will be complete? What about the fact that distribution planning, which your commission approved in docket 18-0935, will look at the distribution system as a whole and specifically load growth and current system capacity? That would seem to be also important information to have in this case to have a more complete record. If the field is evolving, as Delmarva and the hearing examiner claim, the record will never really be complete. But it has to end somewhere. This case would have ended with rebuttal testimony on June 27 and evidentiary hearings on July 11th and 12th had Delmarva not dropped this report bomb, which, by the way, does not seem to rebut much of anything that was submitted in direct testimony. Delmarva, again, in support of the hearing examiner's proposed order, cites the Nasuka resolution as if the DPA is supposed to march in lockstep with Nasuka. You've already heard why that they have cherry-picked what it liked and ignored what it didn't like. I won't repeat that. Finally, Delmarva argues that the commission specifically authorized the hearing examiner to handle scheduling matters and discovery. As we noted in our exceptions, this is not a mere discovery matter, as the hearing examiner calls it. It goes way beyond that. Nor is it a mere scheduling matter. It is not as if the schedule had to be revised simply or because somebody took ill. As we noted in our argument on the motion to stay, it is arguable whether the commission authorized the hearing examiner to handle any issues that it didn't specifically identify. But as we have demonstrated, there is plenty more information that has come out since the DPA and staff submitted their pre-filed testimony, and which would create a more complete record. Mr. Slater has collected many examples of things that we found after we filed our testimony, or that came out after our testimony was due. But we would never have ever thought to ask to postpone the schedule so that we could submit that information. No, we relied on the deadlines set forth in the schedule that all parties, including Delmarva, agreed to. Delmarva has caused the problem that it wants you to solve, but blames us for bringing it to you. So that which we predicted in the rate case has come true. The commission gave Delmarva an inch in that case, and it is now requesting you to give it a mile. We argued in the rate case that you would be setting a bad precedent if you allowed Delmarva to do what it did there. Allowing Delmarva to do what it proposes here and what the hearing examiner recommends it be allowed to do is even worse. It signals that the commission finds it acceptable for parties to ambush other parties prior to evidentiary hearings. Wouldn't the commission now have to allow all parties to engage in such tactics, not simply the utilities? Won't it now have to allow the submission of new reports or testimony when a party thinks it's appropriate and important without informing any other party, resulting in inevitable delays and rendering procedural schedules unnecessary? I thought the commission's rules and practices were supposed to eliminate trial by ambush. For these reasons and many others, the commission should decline the hearing examiner's and Delmarva's invitation to scotch a long-established procedural schedule at the last minute, regardless of how helpful or instructive the additional material might be. That is the fair thing to do, the right thing to do, the only course of action that does not treat some of the parties differently than other parties. So we respectfully request the commission to reject the hearing examiner's proposed findings and recommendations. If you don't reject them and allow Delmarva to submit the report, then we respectfully request you to also give the DPA and staff the opportunity to conduct discovery and submit rebuttal on the report. Indeed, as Ms. Orr has acknowledged, Delmarva did say it believed that other parties should have the opportunity to submit additional testimony, but the hearing examiner didn't even throw us that bone. Alternatively, the commission should order Delmarva to withdraw its application and refile a new application with the report so that the parties can address it in their direct testimony. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Ms. Iori. Mr. Ward, I assume you're going to rely upon the comments made by Ms. Iori?
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Orr?
Thank you, Chair Winslow and Commissioners. Before I turn to the comments I've prepared, I'd just like to comment on the package of documents provided by DPA. This is the first time that I'm seeing these, and I would suggest that the specific content of these articles is not relevant to the decision on the issue before you, which is whether the Gable report should be included. However, if the commission is inclined to consider them, I would ask for an opportunity to review them before you do that, so we can comment if we consider that appropriate.
I don't believe the facts in here are ones that we're looking at with respect to the argument.
Yeah, my
I'm not sure.
argument was simply that new information is coming out all of the time. Where do you stop?
So I don't think you have to worry about that, Ms. Orr.
Okay, thank you, Chair. As I have already mentioned today, the electrification of our transportation system and its impact on distribution systems and ratepayers is a rapidly evolving issue that has captured the attention and interest of public service commissions and other industry participants across the country. Following the modest $2 million electric vehicle program proposed by Delmarva back in October 2017 is precisely the type of program that public service commissions across the country are considering.
Ms. Orr, we think that, we understand that. I would really appreciate it if you get right to the core of it and explain to us why Ms. Iori is not right. Her questions, series of questions about when you knew about this expert report, that's really what we'd like to hear.
Certainly. The decision to commission reports from Gable Associates in each of the jurisdictions in which Exelon Utilities have EV program proposals pending or were considering such proposals was made at a much higher level in the company from where I sit, and I was not privy to those conversations and decisions. However, I do know that from Exelon's perspective, the issue of the electrification of the transportation sector is an issue bigger than this $2 million docket in Delaware. Exelon, at the highest levels of the company, is thinking about this issue as they increasingly see indications that the EV market is shifting. This case is very modest compared to some of the programs being proposed around the country and even by other Exelon utilities. And regardless of this docket, the company is trying to better understand the issues and their impact. It's my understanding that the decision to commission reports from Gable Associates for each of Exelon's jurisdictions was made sometime in or around April of 2018. After the filing of the original application in this docket and also after the filing of the amended application, the company's direct testimony, and the company's discovery responses. If the report was complete in time to be included in this docket, we expected to be able to submit it with our rebuttal testimony or as supplementation to earlier discovery responses. It was only in June when we learned of the level of detail that would be contained in the study and its specific focus on Delaware and Delmarva's proposed program. At that point, we thought that seeking a delay to allow other parties time to take discovery of the report would be the fairest way to proceed for all parties. We did consider it to fall directly within the scope of our planned rebuttal testimony, as DPA raised the issue in their testimony and has mentioned today the concern about ratepayers who do not own electric vehicles contributing to the cost of this program. And so we thought that this report would fall directly within the scope of rebuttal, but we thought that that would be, to use Ms. Iori's term, an ambush. And that is exactly what we were trying to avoid by approaching the other parties and offering a modest extension of the schedule to allow the other parties to take discovery on the report. As I've mentioned today, we're not opposed to them filing rebuttal testimony on the report. We thought that that would be the more fair way to proceed. And I would suggest that there's nothing nefarious about the company wanting to learn more about this issue from a company-wide level. It's an issue that everyone in the business is talking about, and that there's nothing nefarious about Delmarva attempting to provide that information to the commission so that it has a more full and complete record to make this decision on. And I have other comments prepared, but that seems to be what you wanted to know, so I'll pause there.
Well, any of the commissioners have, well, okay. Denrek?
I will
Mr. Tweedy?
I will try and keep my comments brief. I think the issue before your honors is whether or not the decision by the hearing examiner was appropriate and within the scope of what he was assigned to do. I think his intent was to avoid the type of disagreement that appears to be arising about who did what in prior cases and how that might devolve into future precedent. You know, in his written findings, he stated that the commission has consistently sought to assemble a complete evidentiary record, even if a hearing delay is involved. I dislike a hearing delay as much as anyone, but I prefer a hearing delay over an obviously incomplete evidentiary record. That's on page 8. And I think that goes to the crux of the matter, which is that the hearing examiner should be allowed to complete his responsibility of assembling a full and complete evidentiary record, as he was tasked to by this commission. I think there is a procedural question of whether or not this is an interlocutory appeal. I think it's quite clear that the hearing examiner made a ruling at the July 3rd teleconference. He then confirmed that ruling in his written findings, but that ruling was a ruling that he made and subject to interlocutory appeal clearly by this commission's rules of procedure. So once you get to the point that this is an interlocutory appeal, then the standard is whether or not there is can only be brought where there are, quote, extraordinary circumstances which necessitate a prompt decision by the commission to prevent substantial injustice or detriment to the public interest. I think that last piece of that standard, detriment to the public interest, is of particular note. I believe I heard Ms. Iori discuss the injustice that DPA would suffer, but the issue for the commission's consideration is whether the public interest would be harmed by allowing the hearing examiner's decision to stand. I don't see how that standard could possibly be met. The hearing examiner clearly has the authority to modify the schedule under the hearing, under this commission's rules, including rules 1.92, 2.6.4, and 2.10.3. The hearing examiner, as I said, made such a ruling at his pre-hearing teleconference. Both Rule 2.6.4 and Rule 2.10.3 are clear that interlocutory appeal is the appropriate mechanism to dispute decisions by the hearing examiner on those points. So I think the characterization of the hearing examiner's decision at that teleconference and then his subsequent documentation of that in the written document can't lead to anything else but that this is an interlocutory appeal, and that I don't believe either in their written submission or today the DPA has come anywhere close to the standard that is required for that interlocutory appeal. And I think both the hearing examiner and Delmarva made clear that they were perfectly amenable to modifying the schedule to permit whatever additional discovery or testimony was necessitated by this additional report. So on the basis of that, I think the hearing examiner should be allowed to continue to bring this docket to a full and complete record, and that that his findings should be accepted, for lack of a better term.
Thank you, Mr. Tweedy. Mr. Furman?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add beyond what Ms. Orr and Mr. Tweedy said. I agree with that. I think that this document, I think, does provide a kind of much more helpful record. Certainly in the states that I work in, there's a lot of interest in understanding the question that Ms. Iori raised about what are the implications of these types of utility investments on ratepayers, and we fully support the introduction of this document with an appropriate modification to the schedule to allow all the parties to be able to take discovery and to file appropriate additional testimony so they can respond to it.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Stevenson? He must have gone out for jambalaya.
Had to go off mute there.
Oh, you are there.
I have
I'm
nothing
sorry.
to add. I agree with Ms. Tyler's presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. Commissioners, any
Chair
questions?
Winslow, may I have a few words
Yes.
of rebuttal?
With the accent on few, please.
It is. Delmarva finally has now told us when this report was commissioned. It was April 2018. That is before any of the interveners filed their direct testimony. They could have asked at that time. They could have said, hey, we have this going. Can we, wait, we'll submit it. And we could have addressed it in our direct testimony at that time. They did not. Now, I think I heard, and please correct me if I'm wrong because my note-taking skills have deteriorated substantially since law school. But I think I heard Ms. Orr say that Exelon made a decision to conduct such a study in each jurisdiction in which they do business. And so I assume from that they knew that a report that they were commissioning in Delaware would address Delaware. However, their June 22nd letter to the hearing examiner says, because we were not aware of the precise scope, its particular relevance to Delaware, or the completion date of the study, Delmarva Power proceeded with the schedule in this case without modification. Maybe I'm missing something, but there seems to be a disconnect between those two statements. Secondly, we just note that the company has supported the hearing examiner's recommendations, which did not provide for additional testimony by staff or the DPA. It only provided for moving the schedule out and doing discovery. DENREC makes our point for us. When is a record full and complete? Our point is never, basically, because there's always going to be something new. So you have to pick your time to cut it off. And finally, and this I think I find the most amazing. DENREC says that there's no detriment to the public interest, that's only detriment to the DPA. Who does the DPA represent? It represents ratepayers. Isn't that the public interest? Thank you.
Commissioner, that is not what I said. I was saying that that is what she said in her testimony, and I apologize that I have to correct that, but given that she wants to attack me.
That is not what I heard, and I apologize if I misspoke, but what I heard was that you said we don't that DPA was harmed, not the public interest.
Ms. Orr, would you kindly respond, if you would, and if Ms. Iori wants another response, on the dates, if you would clarify the dates?
Yes, Chair Winslow, and again, I tried to couch April with on or about or in or about. I don't have precise dates, but I think the point that I want to make is we did not know the specific scope of this report. We knew that there would be Delaware information in it, but as I said, we thought that it would be a more modest submission that could be used to update discovery responses or to submit with rebuttal. It was not until June that we learned of the extensive detail contained in the report and how important it would be to the docket. I mean, Council mentioned at the beginning that DPA is not necessarily opposed to Delmarva being involved in this space. They're opposed to ratepayers who do not own electric vehicles paying for the program. And this report provides extensive information about the benefits to ratepayers who do not own electric vehicles. And I would also just reiterate again, even if our paper said we supported the hearing examiner's findings and recommendations, we did not mean that to mean that we do not support the other parties submitting rebuttal testimony on the report. We are fully supportive of that. In fact, that was what we had sort of had in our minds, and we apologize for any confusion if it was not made clear that we supported that.
I
Thank
do
you, Ms.
have a
Orr.
response. I'm sorry, but I have to ask, who is we? She keeps saying we did not know. Who is we?
We as Delmarva.
This came from Exelon. Are we, if you allow this, you're going to allow Exelon to do something and then not tell their utility until the very end to spring it on things? If you allow this to happen, that is what is going to happen. They won't tell them. You'll be allowing that. That is, I cannot begin to express my outrage, although I think you can hear it. The second thing is that, again, April. It doesn't matter when in April. April ended on April 30th. Intervener's direct testimony wasn't due until May 18th. They had plenty of time to say, oh, by the way, guess what? This study is being done. We think it might be helpful, but we think you might want to, address it too. Thank you.
Commissioner, is that, Mr. Willard?
Might just say one quick thing. I mean, I agree with what Ms. Delaware had said, but it's hard for me to understand why Delmarva couldn't find out when this report was ordered. And instead of saying, we think it was April, it was above our heads and all that, it's hard for me to understand that. And also, it just seems to me that everybody talks about everything being evolving and new information coming out and all that. Well, if that's the case, maybe they should just refile and start all over and give the report, and everything that's now known can be submitted by everybody, and you'll have even more information to make your decision.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir.
One question for Ms. Iori. Can you specifically tell me what remedy is missing in the hearing examiner's decision here?
Yes, he did not give us the opportunity to file additional testimony. He said we could take discovery. The schedule would be extended so that we could have discovery on the report, but he did not give us the opportunity to address the report in our own testimony.
And Ms. Orr, what is missing if we uphold the hearing examiner's decision? what therefore then is missing from the Delmarva application?
Commissioner Gray, we are asking that the commission uphold the hearing examiner's report with the caveat that if that is to be interpreted as to not include rebuttal testimony, we fully support rebuttal testimony being permitted. So the hearing examiner's report paused the schedule, allowed Delmarva to submit the Gable report, and then I believe ordered the parties to work together to come up with a new procedural schedule. And we fully support that and anticipate that any such procedural schedule that the parties would negotiate would include an opportunity for rebuttal testimony.
What needs to happen with Delmarva and Exelon to prevent us from arriving at this point again in a future proceeding?
I think that we will need to take this proceeding back and report it up the chain and let management at the highest levels know that this was not taken, that the commission would not like, and the other parties would not like to see this happen again. And hopefully that will be understood and we can open some lines of communication. I wish that I could give you more details about how, the sort of chain of command works and whatnot, but I have only been with the company for less than a year, and I apologize that I don't have a more specific response than that.
So Mr. Willard made a proposal that I think is completely acceptable from my perspective, to start the application again, and then Delmarva and Exelon can demonstrate that they can hold to the dates and the deadlines accordingly.
I would just suggest in response to that, that would be a tremendous waste of resources at this point, given that all of the parties have already filed their direct testimony, submitted their discovery requests, responded to discovery requests, and had this, and an amendment of the schedule from this point could be established that would mimic how the schedule would have looked if the report had been submitted earlier. All of the parties would have an opportunity to take discovery requests on it, to file additional testimony, and move forward from there to the hearing.
Mr. Chair, I yield.
This whole situation is very upsetting to a lot of us who have been following this issue for a number of years. There's so many things going through my mind about this issue and what happened with the merger and where the money went and where the money might be in the state. It's almost like, and there's so many intelligent people in this room and outside of this room who have the ability to make an impact upon that money. And we don't all seem to be going in the same direction. And then we have a mix-up like this. And I don't blame Ms. Iori for a second in bringing this interlocutory appeal, et cetera, because she felt ambushed. And unfortunately, Ms. Orr was new and did not know, and I accept her representation about the facts concerning her knowledge of the report and when it occurred, and that basic premise. But the one thing that I would like to see is just, I would like to hear an argument on the merits, for us to decide the merits of this EV thing. I know that it's going on in New Jersey, I know it's going on in Pennsylvania, I know it's in Maryland, I know it's in DC, and for some reason we've run into a roadblock here. And so, in my opinion, to start all over again would be a loss of time, a loss of resources. I'm just, to be frank with you, a little frustrated, but I understand why we're here, and I accept Ms. Orr's explanation, and for that reason, I would be supportive if anybody wants to make a motion of indicating that there has not been a finding of extraordinary circumstances for the interlocutory appeal based upon Ms. Orr's representations, and the matter be sent back to the hearing examiner for all of the whatever Ms. Iori wants, which is essentially discovery, additional testimony, rebuttal, and let's get this thing back on track, and let's get this thing before the commission where we can argue the merits. In the interim, I hope that the powers to be that are out there, and several people here have secretaries they can talk to who are in charge of whole slabs of state government, can look and see if there's some way to make the DPA's job a little bit easier in terms of the financing of this whole thing. I mean,
That would be nice.
I think that really, that I'm serious. I mean, everyone should be working to look to see whether some money that's sitting fallow. I know there's some out there, and I know that some of the merger money has been moved around, but we need to work. We'll work as a quasi-judicial forum and get this thing resolved. But it would be very helpful if this issue is taken up by the level of the top, and they help resolve this issue with us. Having said all that, there's no motion on the floor. We haven't gotten anywhere with my comments. And Commissioner Gray and I may have a slight difference of opinion about what things are, but why don't you consider my comments a motion and see if we have a second? Maybe we don't have a second.
Well,
I'm seconding.
so Mr. Chair, I may have planted a seed on the far end of the spectrum to arrive at the middle. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. But I also would agree that we should treat both sides in this issue equitably, and I think that the chair makes a very good suggestion to modify the hearing examiner's findings in such a way as to allow additional testimony. But I, too, would like to get to the record and the substance of the matter before the commission, rather than the procedures and the hiccups in, the steps we're trying to make moving forward. So I would agree with your motion, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Drexler?
I agree as well.
Okay, there's no further discussion. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion carries. Thank you very much, everyone.
Chair Winslow, you said anything I want, right?
Can we strike that from the record, Mr. Chair?
Oh, no, too late. That was part,
Obviously,
actually,
obviously within the bounds of,
well, I think this is a little bit within the bounds. Look, I don't fault Ms. Orr at all. She got thrown into this. I mean, she wasn't the one who wrote, well, she may have drafted stuff, but her signature was not on any of that. I'm also not throwing stones at Mr. McGonigal, who I respect very much. But this started at the top at Exelon, and if they can't manage to get it down to the levels that it needs to be gotten down, don't you think there's a problem there?
well, I think that,
we're very-
I appreciate your comment. I understand where you're coming from, but let me just say this. It's my thinking that Exelon might actually be in the room via television and via other ways, and that I don't think that making some comment like that from me is at all necessary. I think they understand.
I think it all the more is necessary from the commission.
Well, I appreciate that,
I
but,
understand your.
but I think we've had a long hearing setting forth the issues and the problems, and I do think the message has been sent without further delaying this whole proceeding.
By the way,
Mr. Gray.
Mr. Chair, I did, on the record, ask the question, what needs to happen so that it doesn't happen in the future?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Would it be possible to have a hydraulic break?
Absolutely. You're not, are you involved in the next matter too? That's a one-person hydraulic break. Number 2 on the list is in the matter of the application of Silver Run Electric for CCPN. Or you consider proposed order 9257. True, is Ms. Iori going to be speaking on this matter?
Yes, I believe so. So if we could have a 3-minute break, that would be
Okay.
helpful.
Then, taking that into consideration, let's take about a 3-minute break.
Drew, it's called a bio brake, not a hydraulic brake. It's called a bio brake.
See, I'm still sitting.
Yeah, I know, I can see the shelter.
Before us, we started the last one, the last 3 months. Hey, Rob.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's just opening.
Oh, thank you.
Mike and Steve and Mike did the presentation. Just a few slides. Yeah.
2 hours almost, without the speakers.
I didn't realize we were that More of the story is from the kid.
I thought I was slowly.
How I felt?
Do it.
On the way in.
Saw the vacancy of home. Also, across
I saw something,
Some additional
it said
information.
amendment, something?
Here's the thing, if you look at the legislation, it says the time starts clicking with a completed application.
Right,
Which I did, 100%.
Didn't they do this, did they do this again already?
Well, they found information, but I haven't gone through the whole thing, but he's addressing the cost allocation part. So
Oh, you knew from doing
it
that.
could cause the clock to start ticking
I
again.
went right down.
But wasn't that? Well, I guess I'm asking, I don't have my,
Got 3 copies.
agenda. Wasn't that on the,
No, no.
I don't know where it is. Wasn't that on today's consent agenda?
No.
Oh, it was, oh, it's next. Okay. I gotcha. All right, now I understand why. Okay, now I understand why you're raising it, gotcha.
He's causing the clock to start ticking again.
Okay, well, is he here? No? I don't see him. No? Yeah, but the time doesn't, well, maybe you should hold it for today.
Well, I think we're okay with just opening, because it puts the
Well, no, because
notice out.
but doesn't that, but isn't there a time requirement? That it has to be done in so many days?
And then the next, a year and a half later, you have to tell your CPA about it?
Well, don't they want that 90 days to start?
No, I have the order.
You don't want us to-
And we got the money, yeah, but I know.
I mean,
We had a special person.
he's not here, I guess, so.
Larry, Larry has a test. I have a nice gas station that I love because there's so many gas stations around. For the Shell station, my choice.
Well, I mean, what are the chances that it's, the
But that actually,
because,
so there is an issue.
yeah, so it's not put in there, by the time
And
really
if
doesn't
it's
start
not
to
called,
fall.
not needed.
I didn't see.
Yeah. What he said would be for supplement.
Oh,
The way to stop talking is like,
That's what works.
yeah, that's what I have worked for long, like, yeah, Opsy matters. Gina, it's called a bio break. It's called a bio break.
Bio break, okay, well, Geddes calls it a hydraulic.
That's for him, it's hydraulic.
Okay, we're back in the meeting. Number 2, in the matter of the application of Silver Run Electric Incorporated. Proposed order 9257, will the parties please come forward and make the presentation? As usual, for the record, your name and who you represent. Ms. Schlitz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Christine Schultz with Parkowski, Gork, and Swayze on behalf of the applicant, Silver Run Electric, LLC.
Welcome.
Thank you. As indicated in the proposed order, on July 3rd, 2018, Silver Run Electric did file with the commission an application seeking a certificate of public convenience and necessity to begin the business of electric transmission utility in Delaware, and we support the order opening the docket.
Thank you very much. Mr. Walsh?
Thank you, Chair Winslow and Commissioners. Silver Run's application was filed on July 3rd. We did review it for being complete. Ms. Schultz, am I saying your name correctly?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. Her recitation is accurate. We did, this is just an opening order, of course, and we did circulate this with Ms. Iori with the DPA, and we fine-tuned it, and it sets forth essentially those factors which the commission will review in determining whether to grant CPCN, and it also references the attached Exhibit A, which is the form of notice of publication. This is the 203F, or I should say E, subsection F, incorporates the APA procedures, and therefore this has to be noticed via publication, general circulation. So we included in that Exhibit A the dates to be published in the News Journal, Delaware State News, as well as Silver Run's obligation to file affidavits of publication, and also establishes the deadlines for petitions to intervene, written comments, objections, and the ways by which members of the public may access documents and review the application. And with that, staff would request the commission approve proposed order 9257.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Ms. Iori?
Nothing to add, thank you.
Commissioners, any questions? May we have a motion?
I move that we adopt order number 9257.
And I second?
Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstention? The motion carries. Thank you, Ms. Schlitz.
Thank you.
There's nothing on the hearing schedule. Is there anyone here from the public that wishes to make comment to the Public Service Commission? Okay, it doesn't look like we have anybody that's from the public that wishes to make comment. We have director's comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. First up is Pam Knotts, staff member.
Good afternoon, Chairman Winslow and Commissioners. Delmarva issued an RFP for their standard offer service technical monitoring consultant services on June 19th. And as you may recall, on May 8th, you had approved a change in the terms for the technical monitoring services contract from 1 year to 2 years with a 1-year renewal. There was 2 bids that were received. And as the memo states, one bid was for $56,900 per, and this is per delivery year, and the other one was for $99,490. Both were for 2 tranches. The lowest bid was from Liberty Consulting Group. We have worked with Liberty Consultants, as you know, for the past 6 standard office service cycles because they were the lowest bidder. Staff has had no issues with Liberty's performance or work products and would recommend the retention of Liberty Consulting Group for the 2019-2020 standard offer service procurement cycles with a bid offer of not to exceed $56,990 per year.
Commissioners, any questions? I would just say that I would echo what you said. Liberty Consulting has been reliable. They've been very informative and have done apparently a very good job over the years and for a very reasonable price. So I wholeheartedly endorse your recommendation. Do you need a vote on that?
Please.
Motion to approve the extension of the contract with Liberty Consulting Group as presented.
Second.
Actually, I'm sorry, it's not an extension of the contract, this is a whole new
I
contract.
apologize. Motion to approve the contract with Liberty Consulting Group for 2019 and 2020 cycles.
I second.
Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstention? The motion carries. Thank you, Ms. Knotts.
Thank you very much.
I would like to say that there is a distinguished alumni of the Public Service Commission in the room, Mr. John Farber. Mr. Farber, welcome. You're not going to be allowed to speak, however.
Mr. Chairman, it was very hard to get John Farber into the building. I believe it's going to cost me a lot. The next item, Mr. Chairman, and Commissioners, is the overview of artificial island alternate cost allocation proposals before the FERC. Just to set the stage, on July 19th, the FERC granted rehearing and established a paper hearing procedure. In that order, which you have a copy before you, there were 3 alternatives put forth, 2 by PJM and 1 by Exelon. Some time ago, you asked me, would it be possible to get the PJM principals and Exelon principals to come and at least clarify some of those proposals. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Steve Hurling of PJM. He's the Vice President Extraordinaire. And Mr. Mike Gormos of Exelon, he's also Vice President Extraordinaire and formerly Vice President Extraordinaire of PJM. Gentlemen, your presentations are being put. You have a clicker, and Steve goes first, and then Mike. Mr. Chairman, all yours.
Risa, welcome. Do you want to make the introductions, or are the introductions okay? We'll let Steve go ahead.
I think the introductions were fine.
Okay.
I do have additional paper copies of the
They
presentation.
have it. They have it.
We got it, yeah. Welcome, Mr. Hurling.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I didn't intend, these slides that we provided are actually the slides that we used last year when we developed the materials that we filed at FERC. I figured I would use 2 or 3 of them to speak to the different methodologies. And if it works for you, I can walk through the methodologies that we presented, and then Mike can talk, and then we can just take questions as you see fit. I will start. There we go. Well, I think what I'll do is start. There we go. With the existing cost allocation, just to kind of set a foundation. The methodology that is used for projects, transmission lines in PJM, is cost allocation based on the parties that would be expected to use the facility. It's referred to as a solution-based defects. Kind of the philosophical underpinning, if you will, is that for most problems that we have to solve through our regional transmission expansion planning process, you have a problem delivering from A to B. The solution will typically be another circuit, generally from A to B. And as a result, the parties that kind of caused the problem in the first place are the same parties generally that will use the solution. So you could allocate based on who caused the problem, you can allocate based on who uses the solution and get generally the same answer. This particular methodology has been in place for a number of years. It's very easy to implement, and it can be updated annually, which is kind of why it's attractive. For lines that involve, or projects that involve 500 kV transmission, which this one does, half of the cost of the 500 kV elements would be socialized across all of PJM. The elements that are 230 kV, such as the line that would go under the river, would be allocated entirely based on who would be using the line. In this case, from a modeling perspective, the flow would be entirely from north to south, from New Jersey to Delaware. And that's why you see the allocation that was filed some time ago, with the bulk of the allocation going to the Delmarva Peninsula. A small portion of the project is 500 kV, and that's why you see little bits of the allocation going out to ComEd and elsewhere. But primarily the allocation is based on the expected flow from north to south. Now the difference here is that we're not talking about a thermal overload on a line from A to B where the use of the line is the same as the original problem. This is a stability problem. We have a large generating complex at Salem and Hope Creek. It has limited transmission outlets. There are stability issues. The solution to a stability problem typically is going to build an additional outlet. In this case, the additional outlet is from New Jersey to Delaware under the river. The stability of the plant, though, is based on all of the outlets taken together. So one of the approaches that we came up with, our staff came up with, was to look not just at the new outlet, the line under the river, but the aggregate of all of the outlets from the Salem-Hope Creek complex. So you essentially draw an interface or a circle around the plant, and you look at the same type of analysis, basically who's going to put flow on those lines. Obviously, in this case, only one of those lines goes south onto the Delmarva Peninsula. So when you look at the other outlets, which typically go either west to Pennsylvania or north up into New Jersey, you get a very different allocation. And what we did was we looked at the use of each facility by every transmission zone. We then added them all up, and we looked in a relative way, and you can see that there's a significant distribution of the use of that aggregate interface, which flows north and west to the Philadelphia Electric Company zone and the other zones in New Jersey. So it's essentially looking at the entire interface around the plant as the solution to the problem, as opposed to just the one new line that has been added. The third So the third alternative, and this is essentially the second alternative that we presented, is called a stability deviation method. The attempt here was to look at kind of the consequences of a problem. If you think about a thermal overload, if you have too much power flowing from A to B and the line burns down, it's going to be the people at B that suffer the consequence. With a stability problem, if that plant were to trip out because it became unstable, it would create a disturbance which would propagate outward in all directions. And the analysis is fairly complicated. The types of stability simulations we do, engineers at Exelon and all other utilities would be able to do them, but it's simulation tools that are not as readily available in the industry, so it's a much more complicated analysis. But essentially what we did was we produced a disturbance at Salem and Hope Creek, and we looked at how that disturbance would be felt, how it would propagate outward into the system. We're not suggesting that a disturbance at Salem and Hope Creek would cause a major blackout, but if there was a problem, it would propagate outward, and you can measure the degree to which that disturbance would propagate by looking at one of the mathematical elements of a simulation, which is the angular swings all over the system. Obviously, they go everywhere. It's just like throwing a rock into a pond. The ripples get smaller and smaller. So eventually you have to decide, you draw a line and say anything smaller than X, we're just going to ignore. And that's what we've done here. We look at the disturbance at every location on the system, and what you can see is it propagates outward. You have shares of the allocation going in all directions in smaller and smaller amounts. I'd be happy to get into more and more of the details. The benefit of this method is it relates more to the nature of the problem. The detriment, the downside is it's extremely complex to do the simulations. It would be very hard to automate, and therefore probably not something that you'd be able to update out into the future. The interface method is extremely easy to automate, and anyone could replicate it with basic power analysis tools.
Thank you, Steve. You know, the one emphasis we have here in Delaware is, I understand the difference between the two in terms of the ease and of replicating the stability interface defects method versus the difficulty with the stability deviation method. But my question is, which one more accurately lines up the causes of the event, as well as the the cost allocation issue?
Right.
So what is PJM's opinion on that between those two?
Yeah, and the challenge in all cases is how do you define what constitutes a benefit? In one method, the deviation method, you are attributing the benefit to the parties who would not suffer the consequence of a problem. So the deviation method looks at who would be impacted if there was a problem, and by solving the problem, they are no longer impacted. So the deviation method more represents the parties that are no longer harmed by the potential problem. The interface method is more a function of who's using this new, now better system. Okay, and essentially in the interface method, you ignore what was the original problem. You look at who's now using the system. And the idea is that 10 or 20 or 50 years from now, people will still be using the system even though they can't remember what the original problem is. In the deviation method, you're saying if there was a problem, who would be harmed, and now they are no longer harmed.
Thank you, Steve.
And actually, I'm not even going to bother with my slides because I think I can just really build off of that conversation. I think from Exelon's perspective, I think the issue you raised, Mr. Chairman, is exactly, I think, the issue we were trying to look to resolve, in that But we very much agreed and supported that a solution-based only methodology was not just and reasonable, was not fair. It did not capture a main beneficiary of the upgrade, which was resolving the stability issue. So one of the things we've looked at, though, is we also recognize the problem, as Steve has mentioned, that over time, as the system ebbs and flows, there are other benefits than just solving that problem with an addition like this, and how do you potentially capture that? So one of the things we proposed, what we called, was a hybrid method, which was a little bit trying to get at both issues. We favored the deviation method, the stability deviation method of the two that Steve has mentioned. We think that does capture better those who benefit from solving the stability issues and maintaining the stability of that region, and therefore we think that would be a better method. We do understand, though, and agree with Steve, though, that it's very complex, and it's probably something that would be done once and said, and doesn't necessarily then capture the additional benefits that the line may, in fact, pursue. So our suggestion was to basically combine that method with the solution-based defects method. As I mentioned, there is a benefit to those who will use that facility, both from an economic and a reliability benefit of having, in this case, another feed into the Delmarva Peninsula, and I think the Commission has recognized that as well. I think the solution-based defects method would better capture that part of it. I think what we haven't figured out, and I think we're working on it now, and I apologize, we don't have more details, is what's the right split between those two methodologies? Should it be 90-10, 90% cost allocated to stability, 10% to the other benefits, or should it be 10-90? I think one of the things we would like to do, and probably work with PJM and the others, is to try to look at how to quantify what those other benefits are, look at potential, congestion forecasts and how much benefit does the line bring from a congestion basis. I would imagine under particular maintenance conditions, having a second feed into Delmarva Peninsula will in fact reduce some congestion. We may be able to quantify that to some extent, and that may at least give us an idea of how much is that benefit coming compared to the total cost, to try to sort of set the boundaries. So what we had proposed and what we had asked FERC to do was consider a hybrid method like that, but recognize that there's still a lot of discussion as to ultimately how do you proportion those different benefits. And over time, how do you proportion it? I like the solution-based defects because as things change, as Steve mentioned, we can recalculate it. If the flows are changing, they're being different, that will be captured. That's something the stability deviation does not. But I think that's one of the benefits of this methodology is you can set that piece and sort of forget it and let that be allocated as it is, and then let the solution-based defects do the fine-tuning as you go forward in time, should and if those flows change on the system. So, in summary, that was our proposal to FERC, was really trying to look at sort of mitigating some of the problems we saw with the two different proposals. I think they're both very valid and good proposals. They had pluses and minuses. This was our way of trying to look at how to sort of make some compromises in between.
It's my understanding that FERC found that the solution-based defect method was not just and reasonable, correct?
I think as 100% we would agree. So as the only method, it is unjust and unreasonable.
Okay. And so in order to have, say, 10% based upon the solution-based defect method, you would only find that 10% if there were in fact benefits that were accruing to the state of Delaware.
Right. So if there were additional benefits above and beyond just the stability benefit, you would allocate then that portion, right? So that would we would try to quantify to the best we can what are those additional benefits in congestion relief, increased reliability that whoever, not just Delaware, anybody who is on that facility is using it, what are those benefits, quantify them. If you're saving $1 million and it's a $10 million revenue requirement a year, then roughly 10% may be a proper thing. I don't know what those numbers are at this point.
How do we account for the fact that maybe Delaware would like to buy a Volkswagen in terms of a vehicle, and New Jersey might want us to buy a Lexus?
Well,
in other words, I understand we might get benefited, but maybe we don't necessarily want all of that benefit.
And then I think part of it is you try to quantify the benefits, right? So I think we have ways of trying to capture what that potential projected and I do understand that a lot of it is in the assumptions, but my hope would be to standardize that, because the other issue we have is, while this is a very unique circumstance, we may see others that are similar to that. So we would like to see a methodology that sort of can go forward in other cases. We may be able to choose one or another for this particular case, but for the next one, I think as a transmission owner and as in cost allocation in general, we would prefer as much certainty as we can going forward. So that was the thought, was to come up with ways to quantify what those additional benefits may be, lock them in, get agreement, and it's not necessarily, New Jersey wants you to take more, you want less.
Well, I understand, and I think that I have no problem with the goal, but as you recognize, the transmission owners had that same goal when this artificial island issue came up, and most of their positions were that the cost allocation was just and reasonable. They weren't going to change anything because of all the positive things you did just finish saying about the solution-based defect method. So I guess all I'm trying to say is that we certainly understand that direction you all are taking, and we certainly appreciate the fact that you argued that the present situation was unjust and unreasonable at FERC. I've expressed my appreciation on numerous occasions, and that still stands. But I would just emphasize from my perspective that I understand where you're heading, but we don't want to pay for the Cadillac, so to speak. I mean, we want to pay for genuine benefits, and we think the line's necessary. There's no argument there. I guess with everyone pitching in and working and arguing, we'll probably hopefully come up with the right solution. But any commissioner, Mr. Slater, have any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just want to thank PJM for the two alternative methodologies and Exelon, because they participated here, and about the unjust and unreasonableness of the solution-based defects. I guess my concern is I don't know what Exelon's proposal is going to be, and so I have a lot of angst. I prefer either of PJM's proposals because I just don't know what Exelon's numbers are, and I'm kind of curious how you use the solution-based defect, although I think I know the answer now. If it's unjust and unreasonable, how do you then quantify that?
Well, to be clear, that the commission didn't find the methodology unjust and unreasonable all by itself, right, but in the context of this particular problem and solution.
Right.
And I think Mike said it correctly, is if you look at the range of benefits that can be derived from this particular project, that one methodology all by itself did not provide an appropriate allocation. So, the thing about hybrids, if you look at our two proposals, one looks at the benefits from the perspective of use granted on an interface basis. The other looks at it from the perspective of solving the problem. Their method looks at it from both. The weighting is really the issue that would need to be argued through. But it certainly gives you the ability to tackle the problem from a broader view of beneficiaries.
Okay. I would just like to see additional analysis on the Exelon proposal, because I don't know the number, and so it's kind of hard for Delaware in general, and especially as the ratepayer advocate, to turn around and say, oh, well, I favor this one versus that one.
We are, and we'll probably hopefully get to work with PJM a little more closely, but we're actually trying to run some models now to come up with some ideas as to how that can be quantified and what that quantification would look like. So that is our hope, to be able to file something in the FERC docket. I don't remember when it's due.
Middle of September.
Middle of September.
September 18th.
Thank you. 17th. So we have models. Our guys are starting to try to model it, try to get some ideas that we can put out there to help you understand how that quantification would be. What we think, how we think you could capture what those other additional benefits are, and then see how that stacks up as to then what proportion of the project would be fairly allocated through that methodology then.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Gray.
Thank you. So the stability deviation method, and is this an empirical method developed by PJM, or is this one which is used in practice and best principles by anyone else?
I don't know that anyone uses the method for the purposes of cost allocation. It's a standard output of any stability simulation, so we are simply observing how the system behaves as a surrogate for who would benefit by the elimination of a problem.
So you're using that parameter as a way of correlating the benefit when you study that modeling. So are all problems caused on the demand side, or are generation bottlenecks ever the force driving the problems?
Stability is a function of how much generation you have in an area compared to how close the load is and how strong the transmission system is. So the more generation you add in a small area without building transmission, you will eventually have a stability problem. There are a few clusters of generation that have over the decades been stability constrained in PJM, but not very many. It's a very densely populated system, and the transmission system is pretty strong. So you typically don't run into these kinds of problems very often. This is, in fact, the first time we have ever had to solve a stability problem in the regional transmission expansion planning process. We've had maybe 2 others that simply involved modifying the control systems on a particular generating station. So it's a pretty rare occasion that you would need to do what we're trying to do here, which is build transmission to make existing generation stable.
So maybe when you're thinking about how to take a portion of one model in combination with a portion of another model, there is a solution in where is the problem and what is the nature of the problem you're trying to solve to begin with. And you then can perhaps...
We would agree. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. Very, very well done, and thanks very much for your support.
Commissioner Correa.
For Exelon, once you have your percentages or the share of different methods, when you quantify them, would you have percentage like this on a summary page? We can put it right here and then evaluate both of them?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, because PJM has a lot of percentages and a lot of data here, actual quantified figures, and that's what we'll be looking from you as well. So.
Now, Mr. Farber had a couple of questions he left over from when he was an employee. Do you want to ask them now, or do you want to waive them?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, Mike, you brought up some interesting points. I guess one of them is that you saw potential application to the stability issues beyond artificial island. Do you have any particular characteristics you might be looking for as to an application of these methodologies beyond artificial island?
I think there are other unique transmission, one up in northern Jersey called Bergen-Linden, and it will be going into settlement fairly shortly. Another very unique problem that was a short circuit. It's not a strictly flow-based methodology. There has been a lot of angst on the cost allocation associated with that. So I think at least these 2 for right now are relevant as we move forward as to what precedent we set. And, you know, I think I've said on record, even when I worked with Steve in my prior career, you know, I think solution-based methodology works 99 out of 100 times. That 1 out of 100, though, that's so unique, it may be something we want to look at. And I think, again, our preference, though, is we try to look at them fairly consistent. So maybe there is some different allocation we need, but it also still is based on the solution-based defects. I think the benefit of that is solution-based defects does capture the changing use going forward. That was an issue that was litigated a lot at FERC early on for any cost allocation, because the argument was always, if you set the cost allocation based on the current problem, people 10 years from now will have a free ride in that they'll be using the facility for other reasons and yet not paying for it. That was the whole reason solution-based defects was chosen, was to try to alleviate that one concern. So I think, again, keeping that tie there may be helpful as we move forward.
Thank you. If I could ask one more question. as I recall, a long time ago, I think one of the issues that Delaware had with the proposed cost allocation for Artificial Island was that the electrical characteristics of the Delmarva Peninsula did not really, pardon the expression, generate the need for the Artificial Island facility. Granted, there were some reliability benefits, but I guess I'm wondering as to how you're going to quantify reliability benefits that may be a 1 in 100 occurrence, as well as congestion relief when there was no identified need driven by congestion before the Artificial Island project was proposed.
So I think I agree on the reliability piece of it. That's a little more difficult. And I think one of the reasons we like the stability methodology, deviation methodology, is we think it more captures that stability problem and what Delaware's impact would or wouldn't have been versus then just the interface methodology. On the congestion, I think, and again, this is what we're trying to model right now, is trying to look over a rather longer lengthy time. There is congestion that will materialize on the system. And so looking at the system without the line, what the congestion would be, with the line in, how does the congestion change? Who would benefit from that congestion change? And probably more importantly, looking at maintenance conditions. So I've been around a long time. In Delmarva, the peninsula, the one issue is there's only so many feeds into the peninsula. And when one of those is out, even for maintenance, that has caused congestion. If you go back, I don't know, 10 years ago when this was probably our most heavily congested facility, way back when.
Might be 20 by now.
Maybe 20, we're old. This used to be one of the most heavily congested areas, and we were able to make some upgrades. We removed a lot of that, but again, as we go forward, that will continue to change. So I think what we'd like to try to do is look at that kind of congestion pattern and look at how having another fairly robust feed into the peninsula does provide benefit, and can we quantify that benefit? And if we get comfortable that we can, we would then suggest allocating the cost, some piece of the cost, under that methodology would make sense. Just trying to, and again, I think the goal is just to capture all the beneficiaries. And we agree the stability is a huge part of this, and it's not being captured, and it should be captured. We also agree, though, that the line itself does bring other benefits, and to the extent they can be quantified, we should look to allocate the cost in that method too. And again, as we go forward, I think that would be what we would propose for any unique circumstance that this comes up.
Okay, thank you. I just want to follow up. September 17th, I think, has been identified as the filing date for the comments requested by the commission. I would request Exelon, to the extent that it's going to rely on models that, by definition, rely on assumptions concerning beneficiaries, outages, congestion benefits, that Exelon considering filing as much detail in the appendices as possible so that other parties could appropriately respond to whatever the assumptions are driving your models.
Yeah, that's totally fine. I mean, we are actually using the PGM Promo model as our starting point, and for, I forget which year we're actually using, but we lay all that out for you.
And with that, in order to the recognizability of outputs even from ProMod, you need to know what assumptions were in there in terms of what was online, what was offline, what was operating, what wasn't operating. So to the extent that all those details can be provided in an appendix, I think that would be helpful for us.
Are there any further questions? Mr. Slater.
I know Marisa is feverishly writing, and I'm sure that we're all part of the docket, but can we make sure that we get Exelon's report? Like, can you just email it? I know we're all part of the email notifications, but I get hundreds of them, and it might be helpful. Thank you.
The commission would like to extend its thank you to PGM for a lot of work done on behalf of this issue, and also to Exelon, and a special thank you to Steve and Mike for being here, and safe trip home.
Thank you. Thank you.
My thanks to both of you gentlemen. Thank you for coming down. At this time, I'd request we go into an executive session. And just quick announcements, next meeting is August 21st, and there are no other comments from me. I'd request an executive session, please, to give you advice.
The executive session is for the purpose of discussing pending litigation, and I believe that is acceptable, Mr. Walsh, under the code.
Any